a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
All right, welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. What up, everybody?
Yo,
What's up?
Hey.
All right, we got the family back for 2 straight episodes as of when this debuts. That's not happened probably ever. So technically 3 since y'all niggas talked too long on the last one that made it 2 episodes. But yeah. So how y'all feeling?
I'm feeling good, bro. Can't
complain.
Me
good
too.
and
Cold.
good and unfortunately sober.
Unfortunately.
Oh man. Terrell's like the drunk uncle.
Oh god.
Absolutely.
All right, so today's myth is ancestry test or ancestry DNA test determines race. That is to say that when you take an ancestry test, and we're going to get to this further later, and you get back that pie and they're like you're 45% African or whatever, that tells you what your race is. So ethnicity and race are not the same thing. But anyway, we'll get to that. So yeah, today's myth is ancestry test determines race. I'm just curious what some of y'all initial impressions were. I know for me, I've never really been interested in it. So I know some people were, and that's cool, but I've never really been interested in it. So once I kind of looked into it, I was surprised somewhat just how bad some of the information was and how flawed the science was. But I was just curious what some of y'all thought.
Yeah, I think I was like looking through the research and we've had conversations about this offline before we even thought about doing this for the pod. But I remember when the Ancestry DNA test first came out, I was like, oh, that's dope. Like you get, especially as a Black person, just the idea of being able to have a more, at least what I thought would have been a more precise understanding potentially of like where you come from sounds really appealing. I was not fucking with it because I wasn't trying to give the feds my DNA.
That part.
That's really what kept me from spending my money. I'm not going to pretend that I thought it was wrong from jump, but I really just was reading through some of the fine print and was like, hell no, what the fuck are you about to be doing with my DNA? There's some random clone of me walking around later on because I done spit in this damn little tube for you. I'm not with that shit. But then of course, like as time goes by and just reading about it and learning about it and just really diving into it, it's just like, yeah, it's not even close to actually being accurate. And so people are getting just a guesstimate, pretty much. People are just like, this sounds cute. Let me just go ahead and say, y'all, this, and this. And of course, all the ridiculous people online being like, I'm not racist. I'm actually 2.5% West African. And it's like, shut up, Caroline. You are still white. Yeah. Put the dashiki down.
Oh, boy. Put the dashiki down, man. I think the first time I was introduced to DNA testing, I think it was freshman year college, African Diaspora Studies class, where they showed the Henry Louis Gates special, finding your roots and everything, where they went through each of the Black celebrities and breaking down their race. And, at the time when I was watching this, I thought that it was really cool and really interesting in getting my DNA test done. Never had it done. Years pass. I remember getting my mom an African Ancestry DNA test, which they don't sell your DNA to the big corporations. Of course, that might have changed since then, because that lady even said that might change later on, money, capitalism. But
what's crazy, this kind of intersects with another episode, algorithms. So since, I Googled this stuff, right? And then I got all of a sudden that ad started popping up. African Ancestry is popping up on my Instagram. And she's literally like she's like, why does everybody want this to be free? We're a private company and we have to charge because we don't sell your information. Like they're actually using that as some kind of a marketing ploy. So I guess it hasn't changed according to them. But
now
we'll
going into the African Ancestry DNA kit, doing some research on it. I mean, I kind of went going into it already knew it's not going to be the full message. It's really just going to be clusters. And you should even let you know that's going to follow your matriarchal DNA lineage and everything. But yeah, I was always kind of skeptical as time went by, but as the research we did to prep for this episode, I've come to realize the actual ramifications, of that business, biotech business. There's also bleeds into pharmaceutical business, but which we'll talk about later, and how capitalism is still capitalism, right? So they're still going to try to find a way to exploit a demographic, mostly people of color Black people who are trying to connect to an ancestry that's been ripped from them, and they know this, and so they use this to exploit our, I guess, misfortune, right? Yes. So as the episode goes on, this is going to be a very interesting one. And I hope everybody listens and not jump to conclusions and we don't get a bunch of hate for this.
And by the time this episode airs, it'll be right after the holidays. So we're trying to save y'all some money,
Yeah.
Don't go wasting your money buying these tests.
Right.
Just do what I do. I picked a country and I said, this is where I'm choosing that I'm from.
Yeah, some spot in West Africa.
That's about as accurate as the test anyway. So
yeah, and as everybody's going to see, is about as accurate as the test. But yeah, go ahead, Terrell.
No, I think the first time I heard anything about DNA testing, I was kind of like, nah, I'm cool. I don't really want my DNA out there. Same reason as Cam. First time I really heard about it though, it was like a celebrity. I think it was Chris Rock or something. They said they traced it back to the exact tribe that he was at, and they were like, oh, everyone there looks just like him and all that. And I was like, I'm sorry, I doubt it. Maybe something like maybe they can do something like that. That's what I'm thinking anyway. I was like, maybe they can, but that's not. My broke ass ain't finna. Nah. it sounds interesting, but I don't know. I was skeptical from the beginning of it. Like I just don't. I'm not trusting it.
So I just when people tell me they took it, more so for the genealogy side, where it's just like I found my great 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 grandfather or something. There's more. The science on that is a lot stronger. But when you're like, I'm from Zamunda, I don't know how well that holds up. So typically for Black people, ancestry tests are understood as a means to reconnect with their roots that have been violently cut off through the process of slavery, colonialism, and capitalism. There is a gleeful joy in feeling like one can reunite with their ancestry that was once severed from our bloodline. Take, for instance, filmmaker Ava DuVernay's response in learning about her supposed ethnic makeup and a sit-down with Black history professor at Harvard University, Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Please turn the page. Can you read the percent?
I'm Black. I am Black.
Welcome back. You're blasted off to Sandom Man. Could you read those percentages?
57.3% African. Thank you. 41.5% European. This makes me so happy.
I can tell.
This makes me so happy.
Wait a minute, what difference does it make?
I had a whole narrative in my head of like, it doesn't matter. It's how I identify. It's how I'm seen in the world. It's how I did the whole thing, but I literally just felt like my heart just burst open because it does make a difference to me. What a great thing. This was incredible experience.
Genetic genealogy is transforming our world.
Yeah, nigga, whatever. All right.
Bro, that was painful. I'm sorry. That was fucking painful to watch. Like, bro,
I am black.
bro.
Woo!
Don't
Was
get me
there any
wrong.
doubt in your minds?
I'm happy
tried
every
to-
day
I
that
tried
I'm
to
black,
be-
but get the fuck out of here.
Ava, but that's a moment that I will laugh about for a while.
Oh man.
boy.
Oh god, I tried to be nice. All right.
No, I ain't being nice for that one.
No, I'm gonna keep that in. But
We're not a nice podcast.
okay. I'm laughing because I was holding it in the whole time and Terrell said it out loud. But,
Man, no, that was fucking.
Oh my god.
That was terrible. I'm sorry.
Lord have the day.
all right.
My God.
Leave all the laughter in, please.
Oh god. Oh man. All right. To get back to the to get back, I don't know why that's so funny. All right, to get back to the returning to the argument. All right.
Can you tell me?
So as Terrell said, that was painful for some of us. For others, you can hear the exuberance in her voice. Think that she discovered something further about herself, I guess. Unfortunately, this seemingly innocent response, or painful response, for lack of a better word, along with the entire industry of genomic mapping, perpetuates a series of myths about race. 3 primary myths emerge. One, genes cannot be broken down into a simple pie chart, like you saw or heard in the video. There is no such thing as being 37% African, or what was she, 50? What they're saying is there's a higher chance that you have ancestry from this given area. Not that you are actually broken into parts of percentages in your DNA. There's no such thing as African or black DNA distinct from the rest of human species, as we will cover further later. 2, race and ethnicity are not the same thing. So she says, I'm black, and then on the paper it says she's African. Though they are often conflated as the same. Race is a false characterization of human beings based on perceived physical traits with the purpose of separating groups for economic, political, and social means, hence racism. Ethnicity is a social group one belongs to based on shared culture and or nationality. It should be no surprise that these categories become confused when the very U.S. Census conflates the two. It lists black as a race and African American and ethnicity under the same option for the self-identified category of race. 3, most concerning, ancestry tests reinforce the idea that race and ethnicity are biological. When race is seen as biological or even cultural, the representatives of said race can be blamed for their problems due to their own deficiencies as opposed to the system that racialized them. As Dr. Shay Akil McLean, who's going to be on part 2 of this, her piece, Social Constructions, Historical Grounds, one of the greatest tricks of race is convincing people that racism is a consequence of the grand problem of difference in phenotype and attitude rather than a difference in power and resources. Close quote. Race is a social political construction, nothing more. However, it operates through a folklore that folklorist Judith Newlander says has, quote, elements that could be modified without changing what the tale is about, allowing it to dodge later disaccreditation, close quote. Once we begin to see the world through this limited definition of race, we fail to see how society truly functions. What racism morphs into some biological explanation that could be fixed by creating a more equal understanding of people who belong to a false idea, as opposed to seeing how the idea itself is a total fiction. Consider how race works according to the Field sisters in their book Racecraft. The shorthand transforms racism, the shorthand race transforms racism, something an aggressor does, into race, something the target is, and a sleight of hand that is easy to miss. Consider the statement, Black Southerners were segregated because of their skin color, a perfectly natural sentence to the ears of most Americans who tend to overlook its weird causality. But in that sentence, segregation disappears as a doing of a segregationist, and then, in a puff of smoke, reappears as a trait of only one part of the segregated whole. The sleight of hand is the impact that, in effect, ancestry tests have. They reaffirm the idea that was never real by telling you they're reconnecting you to the roots when it was the concept of race, i.e. racism, that disconnected you from the roots in the first place. to be clear, no one is saying you should not take an ancestry test if you'd like to, I guess. But there are certainly helpful things that can come from it in regards to genealogy within, say, the last 100 years or so. But to tell people they can reconnect with ancestry tests is a bit of an oversell. To tell people their DNA is distinctly written in African or Caucasian genomes is just flat out false. So today we want to explore how race was constructed and how the construction of race became embedded within genetic science that we can now somehow reclaim as reclaiming our roots. All right, so the first section we want to get into is race, or what we understand to be race, is like I said, is a political category. It's not something that or it's a political category. It's something that has been imposed. Racialization or racism or race is imposed on people. It is not the way that people naturally come to be on this earth. It is not how people are born. It is what people often call a social construct, but I don't think that gets deep enough, because that's been kind of appropriated to just mean, you know, I don't even know half the time, depending on who you talk to. They'll say race is a social construct. It's not real, but, you know, black people are more prone to X, Y, and Z. You know, and people will say that in the same sentence and not like clarify like how that's a contradiction if you don't. Being black is hard. Again, being black, similar when they were talking about segregation and being, you know, discriminated against because of the color of your skin didn't do anything. So being black, your skin didn't do anything. So there's nothing, your skin doesn't shoot you, your skin doesn't put you in prison, your skin does, you know, blackness doesn't do that to you. Blackness is just blackness. It's whatever, it's an idea. You know, someone actually pulls a trigger. Say what?
It's completely neutral.
Yeah. Somebody else pulls the trigger. Somebody else is ordered to pull the trigger. Someone else segregates you on a certain side of town. Like that is a system. That is a political economy. That is the state. That, you know, that is not your body doesn't do anything other than just exist. It doesn't beat you up in the same way that white supremacy does, right? So, you know, we need to be clear on that. So the ways that racism kind of like, or that race has been imposed, we're going to break it down in kind of three categories in this first section. So we have the social political angle, we have the spatial angle, and then we have just the general scientific angle. Now all of these obviously intersect, so we're not saying these are completely separate categories. This is just giving you socially constructed ways to make sense of it. So in the socio-political stance, we're going to primarily, for most of this discussion, we're going to pull from the book Fatal Invention by Dorothy Roberts, Dr. Dorothy Roberts. It's a great book that gets into the science of like biomedics and such, and bioscience, and how genetics are now being, how race is now being reinforced through genetics. Even though genetics was supposedly made to debunk the whole concept of race, now somehow it's being reinforced. So we want to look through the actual genealogy of race and see how like that continues to exist today. But from a socio-political lens, I'm going to read a few quotes from her book. She says, "Race is not a biological category that is politically charged. It is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one." And I think that's a very important point. We cannot confuse that people just misappropriated or misunderstood.
The problem with this interpretation of race as a social construction is that it ignores its political and not biological origin. The very first step of creating race, dividing human beings into these categories, is a political practice. I think when we talk, and we're going to dive into this in a second more, just about looking at race as a whole and how its creation was intended as a form of oppression. And I think the more that anyone studies colonization, it's very, very apparent of how there's a whole different form of science was literally created out of this to, in an essence, like validate this. And it was wrong. And people have spent generations trying to literally debunk the ways in which that science itself is racist, the way that science, and especially medical science, is rooted in racism. And a lot of that came out of this notion of defining and creating what race is to begin with.
And to your point, there's been there's been studies done to debunk all this racial science, but it just keeps prevailing on and on. Like the Human Genome Project mapped out human genomes, shows that we are more alike than different, but somehow this idea of, and as we'll get into it, somehow this idea of equating race to genes and making it a biological thing is still prevailing, and it has consequences. And we're going to see that as this podcast episode progresses.
But what we'll see is like racism or race, the idea of it. I said the quote from Shay earlier, but in the sense that, and the Field Sisters talks about it in the sense that once you actually believe in something, even when you're given evidence to debunk it, as we've seen with some of the way people respond to our shows, you try to reintegrate it into your own logic, and it just naturally waters it down, right? Because you try to reintegrate it. Instead of just saying like, this doesn't work, let me reform this idea myself, or let me just flat out reject it and actually hate on the people who told me, right? So before this superstition, when we get to when Africans first started coming here, people from the continent of Africa. Now, often, we might even do a separate episode on this, but often people throw out the number 1619. I just want to be clear, that's not the first time that black people were on this continent, Africans. It's just not, it's not the first time that slaves were on this continent. 1526, there was settlers who came from Spain and traveled to South Carolina, and they caught some type of plague. There's about 500 colonists and about 100 African slaves. The colonists caught some kind of plague. Many of them died off, and the Africans burned down the masters, the ship leaders' home, and they just dispersed, and no one knows where they went. So it was a whole revolt that or whole rebellion, excuse me, that doesn't get told, as opposed to just saying there were just some random Africans that got dropped off in Virginia. This actually got set off with the revolt. It wasn't working. And this is generally what they find in history, even with something like, I don't really care for this story, but it always gets brought up in your kind of typical racism history of, Bacon's Rebellion, Nathan Bacon's Rebellion. I think this story gets mistold sometimes because they usually tell it as this rise of all the working class rose up against the colonists, but Bacon, or Nathan Bacon, the goal was, he was actually mad at Virginia because they weren't, or at the colony of Virginia. Again, it's not a state at this point. This is in 1676. He was mad that they weren't killing off Native Americans fast enough. They weren't removing them from the land fast enough. So he went and found some black folks and some poor whites to rile them up and to go at the governor, William Berkeley in Virginia, so they could take over and move this process fast enough. And of course, some of us who are now racialized as black got involved because we trying to get out of the situation or whatever. So we'll just do whatever. But often I think a lot of white leftists particularly like to use this moment to lift up some working class struggle. And it's like, I don't think we should celebrate moving natives off their own land.
Agree.
Ever.
Definitely.
So I don't know why this always gets so much attention, but it is true that this did cause, I guess, the colonists at the time colonialists, excuse me, at the time to consider other laws that divided the population. I don't want this to be confused with saying that race is simply a distraction. I don't like when people say that. It became
God.
Yeah. So don't equate it to being that. But when we say divide, we mean like actually subscribe people with certain jobs and certain roles in society that sets up certain social relations. That's more than just a distraction. A distraction is if a siren went off and down the street and I just stopped talking for a second. Not the same thing. So they did start passing laws like the miscegenation laws, which bans people who were black from marrying white folks. One of the main laws in 1705, white servants, and this is from Dorothy Roberts' book, white servants receive freedom dues, including a musket, money, and bushels of corn. When they completed a term of indentured servitude, black servants were not entitled to freedom and were banned from carrying firearms. So white people could work their ways out of slavery or indentured servitude. Black people slowly began that began to become a perpetual thing. And then we know changing the law to where the slave actually comes from the mother. So the slave bloodline goes through the mother. And even this is when they start imposing this idea of a bloodline and this idea of being how black is somehow in a bloodline. So if you're born black from your mom, then you're always a slave. But if it was coming from the father, since many white men were raping black women, they wouldn't have been able to produce as many slaves. So they changed the law up. And this is what we would call a form of racialization, because as you can see, this is something that was being imposed. This is something that was being made up as they went. We talked about this a little bit, or really a lot, on the Willie Lynch episode as well. Like, this is something that they made up as they went. Now, spatially, this is something that doesn't really get circulated much, but Dr. Rasul Mawat was on our show several times. He was on the, say what?
I said shout out to Rasul.
Yes. So he was on our show forever, 4 consecutive episodes, talking about his book, Geography is a Threat. And he talks about race is spatially constructed. Most people say it's socially constructed. And I think they can go hand in hand. Du Bois, for the record, is the first to name that. Don't let nobody get that twisted. The socially constructed. But spatially, he's saying that if you cannot put people in a space and therefore put ideas on and mark these people, if you can't put them in a space, those ideas, that social construction doesn't even hold up. So you have to be able to say, like, these people on the plantation in chains are black, X, Y, and Z. We're going to build a town over here, and we're going to have a designated space for these people to live. And then all the literature and the science and the religious BS that gets spread sticks because of that population. I think I said on that show, there's no stereotype. Terrell can't be a stereotype of himself, right? Like, Terrell has to be a stereotype of some community, some ghetto or whatever. And then when I see Terrell, I can be like, oh, he's one of those people from there. And then it justifies whatever I want to do if I'm a racist or if I'm, an administrator somewhere, et cetera. It's not something I would be able to do. And being in a space is how you discipline the population. All right. And that's how they start to form even some of these cultural, like I guess, relatable aspects. But if everybody just wanders around and everybody's just mixing up, ain't gonna be no black race anyway. Like, if you just letting everybody move around freely. But if you're a slave, you get to have land, you don't, all of these different privileges, for lack of a better word, that starts to create and then perpetuate this idea that people really are a part of a race or they're a part of something. But you need space. You need to actually be able to force them to space to do that. If you can't do that, then, I think he's correct that idea really doesn't hold up.
I'm saying that race can only be spatially produced. Because if you don't have any spatial arrangement in which people have to physically live in a certain area in a greater number, the whole thing of what we perceive of populations won't work. People will defy that, arrangement. And people have throughout history when, you did not separate populations, with any distinctive lines. You see this. So Spain responds to the dangerous mixture of Indios, Creole, and Mestizos and Negros. And they said that the Indios, the indigenous populations, were the instigators, right, of the riot. And they controlled the city for 2 days, right? And so they wanted to break that possibility of them ever communicating and being around each other again. And so they created barrios. So literally the term barrios comes from colonial Mexico, and the barrios were the explicitly identified neighborhoods of these sort of categories of people.
So colonialism, segregation later on, these things help reify that idea that this is a population, and you have to do this to populations to justify the extraction and the exploitation that you're going to go about doing, right? So if I can say that, these people are beneath me, and they live over here, right? They're from the dark continent.
Right.
They're in the village. They're savages. All of this othering that Europe did to itself first, by the way, before they even came out of Europe and did this across the world. They did a form of racializing to themselves. You think about this, or scientific and religious as well. This is the third space. So again, to quote Russell again, he talks about in the Willie Lynch episode, Terrell was there, where there was first the religious kind of racialization of savages and their descendants of Ham and shit like that. And black people came from Ham and all of that. And if you don't, that's in the Bible, and that's a misunderstood story within the Bible. And then as time went on, actual scientific theories got created that we call it racial typology, that puts people in categories and then assigns a certain nature to folks, saying that this is some product of science.
Yep.
So when
We
people
start moving from the theology into science.
right, air
Yeah.
quotes, right. So we get in the Enlightenment age, we get Francis Benier, or Francois Benier, I think is how you say his name. The one that's prominently known to kind of create these categories. There are others, but one of the most prominent ones is Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist and a physician born in 1707. He wrote the book Systema Natura. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly. There was like 10 versions of this, right? So in the 10th version, he comes up with these categories. Like, Ryan, what are some of the categories?
Okay, so there's Homo sapiens, man. Homo troglodytes, ape. Homo sapiens, we're into 4 natural varieties. Homo sapiens americanas, Homo sapiens europas, and I hope I said that right. Homo sapiens Asiaticus,
Yeah.
and Homo sapiens after linked.
That's Homo sapiens Affer. They took
Affer.
That's supposed to be an italic, but it's Affer. Yeah.
Affer. Homo
That's African.
sapiens Affer. Linked into 4 regions of the world: America, Europe, Asia, Africa. Homo sapiens europas are vigorous,
White people.
basically vigorous, muscular, flowing blonde hair, blue eyes, very smart, inventive, covered with tight clothing, ruled by law. And then Homo sapiens americanus, according to Linnaeus, was ill-tempered and passive, thick, straight black hair, wide nostrils, harsh face, beardless, stubborn, contented, free, paints himself with red lines, ruled by custom. Linnaeus described Homo sapiens Asiaticus as melancholy, stern, black hair, dark eyes, strict, haughty, greedy, covered by loose garments, ruled by opinion, lazy, black, kinky hair, silky skin. Yes, melanin popping. Flat nose, thick lips, females with genital flaps, elongated breast, crafty, slow, careless, covered by grease.
Niggas are so mad that black people are moisturized. Like
Right.
that forever will take me out. Like,
Covered by
Right.
grease.
it just is
Ruled
giving.
by Greece.
And ruled by caprice.
It's just giving big hater energy, quite frankly. Like
Super.
Yeah, so that then establishes the categories of black, brown, white, yellow, and red. Excuse me, the 5 categories that we now will call a racial group. Now, there were debates, so this wasn't just one man like a Willie Lynch letter or something that never happened. Wasn't just one man that came out and was like, that's it, and then it was closed down. Like, there were debates about this, and there was some Enlightenment scientists who didn't agree and who actually pushed back. I think John Locke was one of them. Ibram Kendi actually messes this up in his book and he tries to make this distinction between anti-racist and racist scientists of the Enlightenment period where this comes out of, and some of the people he categorizes weren't actually what they didn't say what he said they said. But anyway,
Look how arbitrary this is. Like,
yeah, but as you can see,
yeah,
these definitions don't make any sense. But this is the basis of it. This is like where they, you know,
Like racial zodiac signs.
So
Don't get started on that.
yeah, I'm gonna get to that. But so they, like I said, it was the base. So there was Immanuel Kant and Voltaire, and then there was this idea of monogenism and polygenism. Monogenism was to say that human beings come from a common species, but then they evolved to be in separate races. And then polygenism was to say that people actually they were born into the planet as separate races, and they evolved separately. There never was a common ancestor. So that, you know, we're skipping through a lot because there's a lot of BS history on that. As that time goes on, they continue to perfect, you know, this idea, right? So again, this justifies slavery. This justifies colonialism. Like, these things help, and this shit was already happening before dude wrote this shit, for the record. But it just helps give it more backing and more of a foundation than it already had. So it wasn't that somebody wrote it.
We're not wrong for doing this because.
Right, exactly. So yeah, it wasn't somebody that was just like, okay, this is what the races are. Now let's go into the world and enslave them. Like, that's not how it went down. They were doing this, and then this just
Like, we're not wrong. We're not wrong for putting whites in power because they're naturally intuitive or smart. This is just
and muscular,
muscular
hair and
long flowing hair. He's got to be in charge.
And ashy, apparently.
Ashy.
and ashy.
That they was well moisturized.
So
vigorous and all this other.
I don't want this greasy nigga running the country.
But also covered by tight clothing. How is that? How's that passed down?
And that's
I forgot about that one. Yeah.
That's why they was musty, because they was wearing these tight ass clothes and not washing them.
Yeah,
I'm gonna just let that be fact.
So if I wear tight clothing, am I not Homo sapien Afro? What the hell?
Yeah, you see how, like, again, this shit doesn't hold up. But the scientific argument becomes they were just, which we'll get to more later, is that these categories are real. They just were. It's ironic to say this, racist in how they ascribed it. So it's not that people there is race, but, you know, they're just not superior races, right? But they're still race. Like, that becomes but we're not at that point yet. Yeah, so the science just keeps evolving. So, you know, this is just a few things we just picked out. So Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a University of Pennsylvania medical school graduate, he came up with the idea of drapetomania, which, you know, there's a quote here, but essentially it's to say that slaves were lazy. There's a sickness for why slaves were lazy and why they wanted to run away from the plantation. And there was an actual mental illness.
If that's all it took to be considered crazy, by all means, niggas was crazy as hell.
Yeah. So
what?
I mean, he says,
I'm crazy for wanting my freedom.
He said he's
all right.
I think Roberts says whites brought on the symptoms by, quote, this is Cartwright, trying to make the Negro anything else than the submissive knee bender, which the Almighty declared he should be. So you also see right there the mix of of science and religion, because they didn't just detach it. By trying to raise him to a level with himself, or by pulling himself on equality with the Negro. So by white people trying to be fair to black folks or slaves at the time, or enslaved people, I should say, that was somehow like that was actually perpetuating the mental illness. That's what he was saying. This stuff reads like funny now, but we really have to remember, as much as we laugh, this is really how people used to think. Like, this was just as much as we look at something that we find normal, this is how people thought. So it wasn't nobody laughing at this shit back then. It's you know, this really was what it was. There's rascality, disrespect for the master's property. That was another illness. So, you know, riots would be like a disrespect for property, and it would be a mental illness. There was different. Samuel Morton came up with different brain sizes for black folks versus white people, and brain size determine your intelligence. There's the one drop rule that gets thrown around. What she knows interesting in this book, she says the infamous one drop rule passed in Tennessee in 1910 mimicked by other southern states, define a person as Negro if he or she had any Negro ancestor or one drop of Negro blood. I don't know how you figure these things out, but one drop of Negro blood. Other states specify varying fractions of Negro ancestry to qualify as a Negro. Indiana, where most of us live, for example, made it a crime for a white person to marry anyone possessed of 1/8 or more of Negro blood. So different states had different definitions of even one drop. So one state had 1/4, one state had 1/8. There's not even any consistency of one drop. Like one drop don't even hold the same meaning. So again, this concept was built on terrible, faulty logic. Yet somehow, we're supposed to believe people are divided into this.
Right.
But like I said in the opening, like where I was quoting the person that said a folk story or folklore, like folklore is good because it's able to, almost like a virus, it just evades certain things and it adapts to the time. So that's how race works. Like it doesn't always hold the same definition in every given space, but somehow it keeps some level of consistency that keeps people believing in it, even if it keeps evolving over time.
Yeah, and to your point about how this stuff wasn't funny back then, this was really accepted. I mean, this is definitely accepted in the world of academia as well. I don't know if we're going to get into that, but yeah, universities, like top professors, top scientists would actually teach this as a real science. The book Dorothy Roberts in her book made a point to mention craniology, or other racial sciences that have been used to justify our displacement in society, our marginalization, all the horrible, brutal acts that we've experienced throughout the years, the centuries, and it's also interesting, and you'll see as this episode progresses, how a lot of that stuff just evolves and then it's still around. Like craniology, low key, I don't know how far we're going to get into it, but with certain forensic sciences still using skull size to equate that with race. And when I read that part, I was like, oh, that's still, craniology still exists in a way. It's still, and you thought, I thought at least that was just done away with a long time ago, but it's interesting how this stuff still persists. But go ahead.
No, that's good. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like they just recycle this shit as we'll continue to see. Like, you just get rid of the parts that don't work because, they're offensive or whatever. And then you keep the parts that do work, but you never really fully let go of the idea. Because this is connected to real power. Like this isn't just people holding on to it because it's just a nice idea. Like it's materially has benefits. And then for others it doesn't, right? So I'm gonna skip through some of this stuff. There were court decisions, like there was this Bhagat Sai thing. I cannot say this man's name. He was from India, and he was of the highest caste, the Aryan caste in India. And caste and class and race are not the same. Just want to clarify that. But based on the caste he was in, he's initially successfully was granted whiteness in the United States through a court case. And then later on, it was argued that he was not white, even though he proved that from where he was from, he pretty much was the equivalent of what would be white in America at the time. And because at the time, Asians were considered scientifically white at this given time. So again, this shit doesn't hold up. But they later on went on to deny it. And then eugenics, which, Ryan, you can jump in on some of this, but
eugenics, scientists at the turn of the 20th century modernized the concept of biological race by defining it as groupings of geographical populations that differed according to the likelihood of inherited certain physical and behavioral traits. Eugenicists used race as a group, race to group European populations according to ability, intelligence, and moral character. So
now there's just, again, we saw Carl Linnaeus, and we're in the 1900s now. Carl Linnaeus is in the 1700s, the mid to late 1700s, when he wrote that. So we see now eugenics is just a justification that certain people, and we still see this today, that certain people just aren't cut out for it. They just don't have the genes, right? So they're actually detrimental to society and therefore should be sterilized. We know who those people tend to be, right? So they tend, so all of these ideas already exist, and then black folks, okay, we should sterilize them. We don't want them to reproduce. They're imbeciles. Like, the word imbecile was thrown around a lot at this time. And again, this was a mainstream thing, just like all these other ideas. Eugenics was not some fringe, crazy, whatever. This was, like Ryan said, was taught in universities. This was largely distributed. Like it says, she said in the book, the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature listed 122 articles under eugenics between 1910 and 1915, making it one of the most referenced topics in the index.
Yeah, and I think people really need to understand that eugenics was very, very popular. Like, the nation's wealthiest entrepreneurs financed eugenics. The growth of eugenics, Carnegie. Yeah, the growth of eugenics as a legitimate science was due in part to Harvard-trained biologist Charles Davenport. He was a professor at University of Chicago. Like you said, the Carnegie Institute. He helped basically get the Carnegie Institute to fund experiments pertaining to eugenics. It was big. It was super, super big. It influenced legislation. I mean,
it was so widespread and dangerous that it literally was a huge inspiration for Hitler and Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and that's another thing people don't understand. Like, a lot of the ideas that the Nazis had was partly influenced by American laws and the way eugenics, all the things that America has done. Because I want to make sure I get this right, but I'm pretty sure they sent lawyers, like Nazi lawyers, over to study how Jim Crow was executed, how certain laws were done, and take a lot of that information back to Nazi Germany. Yeah. So
it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, they definitely were inspired. There were definitely logs that show they were inspired by Jim Crow. I just want to make clear, like, it wasn't just Jim Crow, because
it wasn't. They went to South Africa as well.
What King Leopold was doing in southern or near southern Africa. What was happening in Kenya. Like, there was different experiments across the continent that they were able to pull from. But America definitely was added to the data, in a great way, but for them, I mean, not for us, obviously. But like Cameron said, it inspired Nazi Germany, and then because of Nazi Germany and World War I, where 70 to 85 million people died, which I don't think people really grasp. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I'm not trying to lessen the impact of that either, because I mean 800,000 people have died in the last 2 years, but 70 to 85 million, like, that is that's just and mainly it was primarily Russians who died the most out of that, actually, but after 70 to 85 million people died due to the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, all of a sudden you started seeing this shift, like, all right, maybe we should chill on the eugenics, maybe we should chill on some of this. Like, it never ends, but you do see there's a moment after, you have obviously the Holocaust and all of that. After all of these people are killed off, it's like, all right, maybe now we should chill a little bit. So UNESCO, which stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, actually issues a statement on race, and this is in Robert's book again, and it's saying race is not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth. This was actually an original statement, because, again, there have been evidence that it put out that it debunked eugenics on its own basis, that the science didn't hold up. And the people who did put that out were actually the same people that formed this statement. And then they actually got criticized for saying that race was pretty much a social myth, and they changed it to say it is possible, though not proved, that some types of innate capacity for intellectual and emotional responses are commoner in one human group than another. So they didn't want to take that line when they initially did. This is in, I think, like 1940 something. I cannot remember the exact date.
Yeah.
So, like, because the World War I ends in 1945, so I think this is like 1948, 1950, somewhere in there. So that just kind of lays the basis for, like, and this is just a little bit of history compared to what really happened, because we don't have time to go over it all, but just to show you, like, there is a large, like, history of foundation of what we call racialization. It's not something that just kind of, you know, rises out of nowhere. So when we get to today and people just tend to look back and they act like those things are so crazy, it's like, no, that stuff never really dies off. And it took 85 million people to die for them to be like, maybe we should chill.
I think, like, sometimes people see like 78 to 85 million and they think it's huge, but to put it even into context, like, as of last year, the population of the United Kingdom was only 67.22 million people. So, like, imagine the entirety of the United Kingdom gone. And still more people. You know, that's like Mexico's only 130 million people. That's 85% of their population gone, destroyed, murdered, and just wiped out because of this horrific ideology that was really heralded as science.
Yeah, definitely. And to Black's point about how people, even if you present them facts and thorough research that's debunking a certain ideology, people still cling to that ideology. Like, in the book, Dorothy Roberts made a point of talking about Darwin's work of The Origin of Species and how it kind of really shook the academic world. It kind of pulled the rug from under a lot of scientists during that time, talking about all human beings come from a common ancestor. But a lot of that, his work was not accepted in a lot of universities, right?
Or it was accepted, but it was modified, right?
And that was my next point.
Yeah.
They would take certain portions of his work and bastardize it, and, you know, to really push their already racist, white supremacist ideology. The biggest example of that was Sir Francis Galton, who was actually a half cousin of Charles Darwin, but he used a lot of Darwin's work to push the whole idea of eugenics and everything, which is, you know, it's fucked up. But you see that happen all the time. And as you'll see with this, again, as this episode goes on, how there's sound science that comes out and debunks the idea of race, at least how we conceptualize it, right? But then a lot of that research gets perverted.
Yeah. And then you know, so after all of that, I mean, Darwin is in, like, what, 1859, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
But after all of that, we get to a point where, like I said, after all those people get killed, I think that was, to Cameron's point, like 3% of the world population. That's a, you know, and this is the World War II wasn't that long, right? Like,
it wasn't that long.
You know, we're not talking about this is a 100-year period. This is like 10 years. You know, like that's also just a lot of people quickly. You know, so 10, 12 years, I think it was 33 to 45, somewhere in there. So it's like not that long, you know. So we move to modern day science. We're going to skip through some things. There's other history to talk about, but modern day science. So Ryan already talked about the Human Genome Project, which was supposed to put a lot of this to bed. right? This whole like
Again.
races being superior or races being completely different, or black people having some special legs to jump higher, and all of this shit, and all of these like, you know, just racist or just completely silly ideas was supposed to put it to bed. So they identified the 20,000 to 25,000 genes in human DNA, sequenced 3 billion base pairs that make up human DNA, and stored all this genetic information in databases. And they found, I'm going to read Bill Clinton.
I'm gonna read it in his voice.
Yeah.
Oh, you have to read
Well,
it.
I want to know that I believe the great truths to emerge in this triumphant expedition inside the human genome. On genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99% the same. Thank you.
Hey, why this dude look to the left? Oh, yeah.
That wasn't enough for people. So what they do, they was like 99% the same. That's not going to benefit us when it comes to how we like to oppress motherfuckers. So let's go figure out how we can take this little 1% and run with it.
0.1. Yeah.
0.1% and run with it. So you motherfuckers know your place. And that's literally what they did.
So it's like,
exactly.
just to give people a real simple science lesson in DNA, I'm gonna keep it very brief because it's not my forte. So I'm gonna even give y'all a little metaphor. Basically, a gene transfers information for a specific trait, while DNA transfers all the information for all the traits as well as regulates gene expression. So think of DNA as the book and genes as the page. Basically, DNA has all the information, and then genes are forms of information, but genes do not make up the entirety of your DNA. So there's coding, there's DNA that is coding, and there's non-coding, and your genes is part of your coding DNA. If that doesn't make sense, it's okay. We will not stress your brain out. Think of that metaphor, and then we can just go from there. Thanks Ryan for the Bill Clinton, read. But like Cameron said, 0.1% became the new fight. Now it is true, and Robert says in her book,
this 99.9% soundbite commonly deployed to debunk the biological meaning of race is not enough, though, to prove that race is not biological. And then she goes on to say, like, as fellow primates, chimpanzees are extremely close to humans. We share 98.7% of our genes. Humans are also 90% genetically the same as mice. And while it is true that the 0.1% of human genetic difference is meaningful, it does not mean that human genetic difference is actually organized by race.
And that last part is key, right? Like, it just because there's a difference doesn't mean that justifies you being a separate race. That could just be a difference. Like, we all have differences, but it doesn't justify why I should be in a separate category of people. Exactly. And therefore treated differently, right? Like that doesn't hold up.
And people also have to realize that these different categories that we place it, that society places us in, is definitely not biological, because if you go to different countries, let's say, i.e. Brazil, these categories that we might be in might completely be different from the American context.
Yeah.
And you see that all through Latin America. So, if it was biological, and I think Dorothy Roberts made this point, if it was biological, then the categories would be the same no matter what country you're in. But you don't see that. It's not. Because it's completely, like we said at the beginning, this is socio-political. This is all constructed,
Yeah,
but
you can be in South Africa, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
You could be colored, and then there's black. There's like actual two different categories.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're lighter skinned, you could be considered colored. Versus in America, you're probably just still black. Unless you literally pass, you still black,
Mm-hmm.
Or you're, Hispanic, which isn't technically a race, which is another thing about the census. Probably cut this part out, but it is good information. Hispanic actually does not appear in the racial category on the census.
Mhm.
It only appears in the ethnicity. So that's why even if you do like a job interview and it'll be like, what's your race? And it'll ask you if you're Hispanic or non-Hispanic. But Hispanic used to be on the census, and they tried it and then they took it off because it related primarily to Mexicans. Because when Mexico was swallowed by the United States, they were guaranteed that they could be full citizens. And full citizens at the time, after that war, meant they could be white. Because obviously there's no such thing as being a full citizen when you were black, right? So now to get to the actual some more of the science in relation to DNA, just something else she says about how there's more genetic diversity among the groups that we put people in than there is even in the groups that are supposed to be separate of us. So she says, this is Roberts again. To the contrary, human genetic diversity occurs in a continuum that cannot be partitioned by clear boundaries and that crosses what are commonly considered racial lines. Consider how in the United States, people with any amount of African ancestry are grouped together in one race, yet the greatest amount of genetic diversity in the world exists in sub-Saharan Africa. Homo sapiens originated in Africa and remained there for almost 200,000 years before. She later says a person from the Congo, a person from South Africa, and a person from Ethiopia are more genetically different than in each other than a person from France. Because again, Africa is not a small town, right? It's a big continent. There's different weather patterns, all kinds of shit, right? So even the people in Africa don't share the same genetic traits but when you take a test, I'm 85% African, right? But so it assumes like African is the same all across the continent, genetically speaking, and it's actually not, depending on where people are. And people's DNA still isn't, even then genetically isn't based on like, again, their skin tone or anything. That's just about the fact that they lived in a certain area and they evolved based on that situation. And then skin itself, we had Dr. Nina Jablonski on our show a long time ago when we talked about melanin and that being the superpower of melanin being a myth. And she said, skin evolves separate of phenotype. So that's why you can go across the world and see people who are quote unquote dark skinned, but they don't have the same noses or the same lips or the same eyes. And they can be all across the world because skin and your nose and your lips didn't evolve all like in the same kind of like set series of features. But that's how race gets ascribed, is that all of that is the same thing, and it's just not. She also says, this is coming back to Roberts. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to both the tallest Mazi and the shortest Pygmies people. Dark skin is found in all equatorial populations, not just in the black race as defined in the United States. Actually, that was Richard Cooper, a physician and epidemiologist at Loyola University. So as you can see, like, this is the science that they're using to try to justify these tests. And as you can see, like, when you test for these things, genetically, these people, like, folks are all mixed up. These categories don't hold. So the ways that they do these tests, when we're talking about like tracking some of the genes, are these things called SNPs, and it's population genomics leverage the tiny percentage of genetic variation in human species to identify differences in frequency of certain alleles or versions of genes among groups with different geographic origins. To understand this process, we have to start with the SNPs and the microsatellites. Single nucleoid polymorphisms, or SNPs, pronounced SNPs, are particular points where the genomes or different individuals vary by a single DNA-based pair. Later on, she says, scientists can infer ancestral relationships from the frequency with which these alternate spellings occur in different groups. So to try to keep that simple, they test for different frequencies and the very little difference that we have in our DNA, in our what we call our genome. And those frequencies, based on what we'll get to, their quote unquote samples that these companies have. They have samples, and we'll talk later about those samples are often, incompetent as well. But based on whatever samples they have in the system, those frequencies that they get, they say, okay, this might point more towards this African sample over here. This might point more towards this European sample, and then that's how they end up making up your quote unquote pie. Not based on any like, here's the African gene, like that. That is not what happens.
Like
So
you have a probability that you might come from this area right here.
if we collected those
If-
samples, and those
if-
people, and these are not
yeah.
old ass bones, these are still living people that live in these areas. So you also have to question that.
Exactly.
You know, it's not like they found some bones from a nigga and that was in like 1440 and was like, damn. You know what I mean? So that's not what's happening.
No.
So they have these clusters. So what they have is they have all these samples they collect. They have your DNA, and then they have an algorithm in their computer that has clusters. Clusters as in, like we were talking about with even Carl Linnaeus, like you come from this part, and they cluster the samples, or they cluster your results into these particular groups.
Yep.
So there's different studies. There was Noah Rosenberg, biologist. He did a study that was flawed. Rosenberg's team, this is again Roberts, fed into the computer genetic information from 1056 individuals representing 52 global populations. Then, following a specially designed algorithm, the computer went to work. Although race was not mentioned, the major geographic regions that matched the genetic structure they discovered, Europe, Eurasia, East Asia, Oceania, and America, were quickly translated into traditional racial divisions. Because a lot of these tests will say they're telling you about your ethnicity. They'll never say that they're telling you about your race. That's confusion that people make because ethnicity and race gets confused, like we showed even on the census. But the tests are always saying ethnicity because they know they can be held liable if they're telling people about their race, because even scientists who use this bullshit rarely explicitly say that's what they're doing anymore. So now within this test, they found genetic differences among people within the populations they studied accounted for 93 to 95% of all genetic variations the computer uncovered. Only 5% of variation found existed between the groups. So most of the genetic diversity existed among the groups that they, like, let's say me and Ryan are in Africa, we had the most genetic diversity in our group. So if that's the case, then why would you have those clusters? And the point that she makes is that they actually tested from 6 to 20 clusters, and they found that if they expanded the clusters to 7 or 8 or 9 or 20, the genetic breakdowns would be different every time. So there was no actual basis for those clusters other than the algorithm itself. So if you create 5 categories, then when you test people, they test into those categories. There's no actual genetics that says you should be in those categories because those are socially constructed categories. Like, so if you tested for 20 categories, you would have a whole different makeup that would go beyond those 5 areas in the world. If you tested for 8, you'd have a whole different makeup. They just chose 5.
So it's wrong. They're lying to y'all. They don't even know what the hell they're doing. They're just winging that shit. And other studies that are working off of them don't even utilize large sample sizes. And so it's just as credible as when we talk about like the news and they're like, oh, we polled, we did a political poll and 30% of America, and the fucking sample size was like 5,000 people from fucking Minnesota. Yes.
On the west side. Yeah.
On the west side of Minnesota. That's a representation of the whole of the US. Even when they were talking about database samples, it was like in another study, they only utilized 3 sub-Saharan populations, 2 pygmy groups, and the Lusongo that stood in for all of Africa, while Chinese, Japanese, and Cambodians represented all of East Asia, and that Northern Europeans and Northern Italians were the Caucasians. So then, of course, anybody who's taken this test, that's not an accurate reflection of anything. Like, there's beyond far more diverse groups for that people could have been from, that we can have ethnic markers for that you're not even going to know. So your people are just sending their money in, sending your DNA in for these folks to lie to you. And that's not only just a waste and an invaluable use of science that could be used for things that are beneficial, but it's also completely disheartening to folks. And so, you know, this myth we're not just debunking this just to throw science out there and be like, all of you niggas are idiots, but to really talk about the ways in which they are utilizing ignorance to not only steal from you, but then to find ways in which to continue to just promote an oppressive system of race that's not even real.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very well said.
Yeah, well said. I was gonna say the same thing. Yeah, I mean, there are there's so many examples. We don't even need to share all of them, but it's just like there's so many examples of like it says, if you look at a map of the world, you will see parts of Africa very close to Europe and the Middle East, and other parts are very far from these regions because they are close to the Arab Peninsula. African Somalians are genetically more similar to people in Saudi Arabia than they are to people in Western or Southern Africa. Likewise, Saudis are more similar to Somalians than Norwegians, who are geographically more distant. Yet, molecular scientists routinely refer to African ancestry as if everyone on the continent is more similar to each other. So again, these are just imposed categories. Now, it's not to say you can't say you're African or you're black. It's to say that is a political thing, and I'm all for it being a political thing. Like, I would claim blackness and African all day on a political basis. I don't claim it on a biological level, though. That's the difference. So it's like you can still have a cultural belonging to a group, all of that. We're not advocating for some kind of like colorblind or color evasive.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
You know, we're not saying that.
Do it the way that I did it, right? I said, I know that I'm black. I know that as an African American that my lineage goes back to Africa, most likely West Africa, because we know historically the bulk of slaves were taken from West Africa. The way that I decided that I was going to make my claim where I wanted to choose from was Battle of the Jolloffs, you know?
Oh, man.
With the exception of Black's bad taste buds, Ghanaian jollof is just gonna win, and therefore that and one of my best friends. Yeah, you're bad.
So you represent Ghana. Okay.
I think Nigeria's win, but
okay. You know. I thought for sure she was gonna say Nigeria.
Absolutely not.
Nigeria.
Hard-boiled rice is not for me. Anyway, and I know that there are people in here who are hating, and that's fine. Rep your set. I decided that I was Ghanaian, and
I mean,
I'm gonna wave my flag proudly.
I mean, I represent Sierra Leone, so shout out to all my Timne tribe people. You feel me? You know what I'm saying?
And even those areas, that's why even when they tell you that, it's like even those areas are based on colonialism, right? Like, it wasn't on Nigeria.
Yes, exactly.
You know what I'm saying? So it's like
these boundaries, all geopolitical, right?
Yeah. So I'm saying, so even when they're like because it'll say you're African, then it'll be like a subheader, you're Cameroon. But they talk about she talks about in the book, like they don't have a group for you. That's why even if you go to Ancestry.com, I was just on there yesterday, and they're like your ethnicity may have changed. Because they literally say this because they're constantly updating their database, so they get more samples from somewhere, and then they're like, okay, you know, now you're more this than you might formerly be. Because if they didn't have it, let's say, you know, you might have ancestry in North Africa somewhere. If they don't have any samples for it, it might jump all the way up to Europe because that's closer. Right. So then all of a sudden you're more European than you're North African. Like that's what I'm saying. Like they don't have enough samples really to even be making these claims. And then African Ancestry probably has, relative to everyone, some of the best samples from what I could find. If you still want to do this, but I'm saying Ancestry.com only has like 55,000 in overall. Like African Ancestry's got more than that, I think, just for Africans. So that's what I'm saying. Like I'd be careful with, but I'm not repping anybody. I'm just saying, you know, and African Ancestry we joked about doesn't sell your information, at least.
At least they tell you that.
That's what they say.
That's
what we're told.
Always read the fine print, and I don't know if you're going to keep this in there, but she even like alluded to. I remember on the Breakfast Club interview, she was like, you know, we don't sell your information. Now, that might change in the future. She kind of alluded to
that. We don't sell is not the same as we don't give it out.
Good point. Good point. It doesn't mean we don't share.
Right. So,
because you can lease it. You can lease it. You can be like, hey, you want to take a look? We're just gonna charge you a fee for that. You know,
the initial investors paid up front, so that information's already being shared.
They gotta make money.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if there's a little goat walking around that looks like you in 10 years,
capitalism is still a thing. Like I said,
and that's why they use those celebrities to promote this shit, because they wanted to get it out there. So when we see I'm black or whatever that shit was, like, you know, that was a way of promoting. I remember watching that too. Like, that was actually a while ago now, but that type of thing, it exploits, and Ryan, you said this at the beginning, it exploits something very real that black folks have, because we have been cut off from this shit. I think I said it too, like, it exploits that. So it's like, but again, this stuff, it's not just about whether or not you take the test, is that this stuff has real consequences as far as how we come to understand race. Like, there's been tests that have been, or not tests, there's been studies that have shown that people who take these tests tend to identify more likely with being biracial all of a sudden, just because they took one of these tests. There's other stuff that shows white folks are actually using these tests to get minority scholarships.
Yep.
You know, so it's like, so it's like there's like websites that explain this stuff, like how to use this to get a minority scholarship. Elizabeth Warren pretty much did this herself. You know, so it's just like, so I'm saying, like,
just sit back and think about the audacity of white people to do that. Can we just really just think about, they really, based on the DNA test, is like, I am going to apply for a minority scholarship. Like,
because Ancestry.com.
Because of Ancestry.com.
If
that doesn't,
African.
Yeah.
If that doesn't reek of white privilege, I don't know what it is. See, it's still a political thing, right? Still a political, social thing. We just proved it. You're using your privilege to get a minority scholarship based on this test that might be faulty anyway. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. What I'm saying. This is the problem with reform, but they try to reform the ideas, and it just doesn't. It just doesn't hold up. But there's more.
Oh yeah, wait, yeah, there's more.
She says 3 central myths about race. You know, about this idea of a pure race. She says there are pure races, that each race contains people who are fundamentally the same and fundamentally different from people in other races, and that race can be biologically demarcated. The concept of dividing a person's genotype into racial components assumes that each component is racially pure. We can only imagine someone to be a quarter European if we have a concept of someone who is 100% European. Like, so you have to have pure races, and this kind of like goes back to the stuff like one drop rule. Like, it goes back to that kind of thinking. Like, okay, there's a drop of this and a drop of that, and again, that's just not how people are made up. Like, that's not how genetics works. And then the tests themselves can't even get all your ancestry anyway. So if anyone's familiar with like mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA and Y chromosomes, she says lineages used by ethnic ancestry companies raise a whole other set of issues. To begin with, these lineages cover only one line of descent. They include one female or male ancestor per generation, but every individual has hundreds of ancestors going back for a few centuries and thousands over the course of millennia. 8 generations alone encompasses 256 ancestral lines. Since the time of slave trade, about 14 generations ago, any individual has accrued more than 16,000 ancestors. But this same customer has thousands of other distant relatives who are not accounted for in the mtDNA or Y chromosomes test, and who may share common ancestors with people of other parts of Africa or beyond. That's why people can take tests who are actually who are related. Brothers and sisters can take tests, and they will have completely different makeups. Not totally different, but they'll have different makeups, even though they're related, because they're just pulling from different parts of those bloodlines. And those
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking about mentioning it earlier. But yeah, you can have a different your genetic material or between you and a sibling can be different. You know, it's not going to all come out exactly like the same. And I think like a half, you could half this or 1/4 this, it doesn't work like that. You know, it's it just doesn't.
Again, DNA is a variation. You know, it's not a like full like single identifier of single gene. So there are different variations in your genes that are more prone to certain things than others. Again, there are differences that people have. Like we were talking about before we turned the record on how 3 or 4 of us are allergic to fish and fish and peanut butter. But that doesn't mean we're a race of people. You know what I'm saying? Like that's
right. And I have no food allergies.
Yeah.
You're not gonna put me in a whole different category.
Yeah.
You know.
That's what I'm saying. Like the difference is that that have been chosen to make these categories are politically imposed. They're not things that, you know, are just naturally come from. Because again, you could divide people for all different types of reasons. It's just like, you know. Again, I want to keep reemphasizing the point here. It's not about just beating up on the test. Is that this stuff? We don't have time to get into all of this, but like this type of information, we were joking about it being sold, but she talks about it in the book. It does get used for identifying criminals. It does get quote unquote criminals. It does get used for facial recognition software. It's in some countries, it's actually used preemptively. To discover who will be a criminal before you might even have committed a so-called crime, like
Minority Report.
Yeah, DNA test. So it's like this stuff gets weaponized, and then on the other end, it gets to tell us that, you know, we're connecting with something, and it assumes race is some kind of thing, and it denies the political reality of what it is, and it goes always back to this, like, you know, well, we just need to understand each other better. We just need to see, we appreciate each other's differences. You know, my forehead's not as big as Cameron's, but we can come to love each other, you know, or something.
For those listening, I just flipped him off.
But, you know, we can come to love each other. And it's like, it divorces us from political economy, how capitalism functions, you know, and the relationships that sets up. And it gets us to just looking at our quote unquote differences. And that is more, I will say that is, I would argue, more of a distraction than understanding how this thing actually works.
Pharmaceutical companies take this kind of type of information and try to market certain medications to you based off this racialized science, right? Talking about you, because you're black, you need to take this type of medication or that type of medication, when in all actuality, the type of medication that could be marketing to you, it could already exist in a different form or whatever the case may be. And it's probably not even thoroughly researched or, you know, but it happens, you know. Capitalism has no shame. They will use whatever they have at their disposal to get your dollars, to get your money.
Or use it to oppress you. I mean, we know that the notion of race has, especially in the medical industry, has been used to state that Black people that we aren't susceptible to various diseases, which is false. Niggas, wear sunscreen. I will preach about sunscreen forever. You can, in fact, get skin cancer. But even aside from that, right, they talked about Black people, that Black women specifically don't feel pain on the same rate. All that. Or that all Black people at all don't feel pain, because they were literally running tests with utilizing Black slaves who were trying not to be further mutilated and abused, to likely swallowed as much pain as they could so they don't die. And that led to them literally writing in scientific books that we don't feel pain. That we, even in an article that I was reading, was talking about that at a free osteoporosis screening, that they were essentially turning away Black people, because especially Black women, saying that, oh, like, well, because you're Black, like your bone density, you're less likely to have osteoporosis, and wouldn't even test.
Glad you brought that up. Yes.
Wouldn't even, like, literally would not test for it, and that's not true. There's no factual basis for it. And so when we think about, like, the implications of this, like, yes, an ancestry test, DNA test, you know, can make your heart feel a little whole, that you feel more connected. But the reality of what DNA work as a whole, this notion of race as a construct, has been continuously used to oppress us. And so until we understand this, then I think one of the questions that was posed when we were planning for this was, like, can racism be solved through science? And if that was true, then once Bill Clinton said that, you know, the 99.9 niggas would be free, but that's not true.
Exactly.
science, like Ryan, you were saying, it's not a neutral thing. It's just, I mean, that is a fact. Like, it's not a neutral thing. Even when it's used for good, it's not neutral. Because, like we were talking, like, depending on the questions that you're asking, often will give you the solutions you're looking for. But science is just simply a methodology. And you use that methodology to try to understand, certain phenomena. That's all you're doing with science. Science isn't a religion. Science isn't a belief system. It's a methodology that you apply to certain problems to find solutions and to find better ways of navigating it. So if you're, and people do it all the time, they don't realize they're being scientific, but if something breaks in your house, you look at it, you try to understand it, and you test it, and you realize this is wrong, and okay, I need to go buy this, or I need to fix that, or I need to fill in this hole, or whatever, and you just apply a certain method of curiosity, essentially, to figure out what's going on. If you're not applying the method correctly, it can go anywhere, right? But I think that's how you have to judge science, is how are they applying the method, not simply it's science. Like, that's when it becomes a kind of religious thing, right? Like, so with the test, even, it's like, well, they tested X, Y, and Z, but we went and we looked at the science. We're like, damn, the science ain't really that strong. So we just can't, we got to grade this as a myth.
To your point about it being a methodology, when applied correctly, science can be self-correcting, right? Any scientist will tell you that the history of science has, been littered with some atrocities, especially if you're thinking about psychology, right? But as time goes on, they're able to correct those. New information gets found, they're able to correct it and able to go forward, with new information and stuff like that. But sometimes, like in the case with Charles Darwin, the example I made earlier, but a lot of people still want to cling to like old ideals and want to use certain aspects of science to push their own fucked up ideologies.
One last quote, I'm gonna ask the last question, we'll be done. I found that quote I was looking for earlier. But the Karen and Barbara Fields, in their book, again, the Racecraft, they said, when a person acts upon the reality of the imagined thing, the real action creates evidence for the imagined thing. And I'll read, I know that's kind of like heady, so I'm gonna read that again. When a person acts upon the reality of the imagined thing, the real action creates evidence for the imagined thing. Right. So if you believe that, I always like to pick on Terrell. He's not here right now, so I'll pick on Ryan. If I think that, if I'm a cracker and I think I think Ryan is a thug, and then I go and call Ryan a thug, and maybe I push Ryan and Ryan punches me in the face, I'm like, no, he's a thug. And he did punch me, but I provoked the whole thing. I set it up. I came in with my idea. He responded a certain type of way, and I can say, okay, he's a thug because he was violent, even though he was defending himself, even though I probably deserved it, right? But that's how racism works. It's like race in general works. Race or racism works is essentially you can say something, and since you already believe in it, you just go out with a predisposed idea, which is bad science because you're supposed to check for that, and then you can say, okay, because I found this, it's real.
And because you got other people to believe it, and to join with you to think it, now all of a sudden this is fact, not fiction.
Yeah, and it's just like that doesn't hold up. So, so as y'all can see, we have a part 2 of this. Like, we're gonna talk to an actual biologist who knows way more than we do. But as y'all can see, this doesn't really hold up. I was gonna ask one more question as far as like, with this information in mind, I would even ask this to the audience too. What does it mean to return to our roots? Like, what does that actually mean?
That's a very good question.
I think for me, like, even thinking back to initially when I first saw that these were coming out, and I wanted to know, I wanted to be like, where do I come from in Africa? How am I connected? And once I got over the fact that I was not going to do actually one of these DNA tests, the larger question to me then was that I posed for myself was then, if I want to connect with Africa, I don't need a DNA test to tell me. I can actively go out and learn about the continent as a whole. I can learn about African people throughout the diaspora. I can learn about culturally relevant things, that I can eat African food. And, I thankfully was able to go to Africa. And I hope to save to be able to once again go and like spend time on the continent, talking to people, getting to know people, and really diving in to understand more about the continent itself, and find for myself historically what I connect to, and not even just there, but like there are people here that I've met, that I have plenty of friends, thankfully, that I'm blessed to know that are from various parts of Africa, who have shared with me things that they know, that their families, pictures, video, cultural experiences and traditions that have allowed me, as somebody who's African American, to feel very connected and find the parallels. Right? We on Twitter, on TikTok, we always see these things where Black people are like, "Damn, like you went through that, I went through that," and that's not even just something that's a Black American thing, but there are so many things that culturally connect us. And so for me, that really was my way of feeling rooted, and not necessarily returning to my roots, but really just digging in the ground to see the roots that were already there that I just hadn't tapped into.
Ditto.
Yeah,
I mean,
trying all the African food that I could, which is why I know that Ghanaian jollof is better than Nigerian jollof.
I'm not doing that.
I went to an West African restaurant in Denver, and we just went in there and we had, I don't know, I don't want to get off subject, but we went in there and we were like, "Hey, surprise us," and they just gave us a bunch of different varieties of foods. Man, it was dope. It was really dope. But yeah, I don't know what Cameron said. Finding your roots. I mean,
you don't even have to agree with the question. That's why that's what I'm saying. With that information, is that even a thing?
Yeah, because I'm up there just trying to think about it, because I guess it really depends on how the person is going to define it for themselves, right? For me, I mean, I'm really into culture. I'm really into the diaspora. I'm really into, learning what Black people are doing in this part of the country, or what they're doing in the UK and everything. And that's just how I guess I maintain my roots, because I guess I look at everything through a Pan-African lens. So when I think about Africa, I think about Blackness, I don't stick to the African American concept or construct. I just, if you're part of that diaspora, for me, you're Black, and in my opinion, we're connected. But yeah, that's just how I view things. And I just want to learn as much as possible when it comes to that. Whether you're in the Caribbean, whether you're from the continent, across the pond in the UK, it's always, I don't know, I'm always curious. That's just how I view things.
Yeah, and I think, like, for me, I guess everything is always political. So it's like, for me, it's like, when we did Africa Ain't Got Nothing to Do With Me, the myth, like, and we try to make sure we made material connections that went beyond just African symbology. Like, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those things. It's just like sometimes that can be watered down, and I don't really use the term cultural appropriation because I don't even know what people are talking about anymore. But I'm saying, like,
I don't either.
That can become very just hodgepodge for me, right? Like,
yes,
I got an African name, or I got a daishiki on. Like, I'm not saying, like, those things are helpful to help you return to, like, some sense of culture, but I'm just not really big into that necessarily. I think politically speaking, our fate is very much linked to the continent. It's not the only place that it's linked to, but I think our fate and materially that place Africans having the power to decide their own fate and determine their own fate and not be ruled by outsiders, particularly Europeans. I think that for me, that's what connects me, because I understand that struggle helps everyone in the diaspora. I always consider that's the connection I see. And then there was a quote from philosopher Tommy Shelby. He was talking about the differences in Black solidarity, and he says, like, for him, and I would more so agree, like Black solidarity is based on a common experience of anti-Black racism and a joint commitment to bringing it to an end. I would add capitalism and other things to that list, but I agree with them generally. Versus a foreign Black unity that emphasizes the needs to positively reaffirm racial, ethnic, cultural, national identity. I think you can have both, but I think your identity should be affirmed as some type of political project, not just I'm just proud for the sake of being proud, or I'm just African for the sake of being African because I can wear earrings and all. Like, I don't think that really matters if it's not tied to a bigger political project. That's just me.
Yeah. If you're taking an African, if you took the Ancestry DNA kit and you find out that you are from, that you have your genetic makeup is in part from Sierra Leone, are you actively aiming to be immersed in the history and the culture as a means to both connect to and to help liberate it? Or do you just want to be able to say it and wear cultural attire?
Yeah,
it has to be both.